Between 3 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., battle-hardened Russian combat engineers, which again were like elite assault infantry based on their combat experience from the Great Eastern European proxy conflict, wherein they had assaulted some of the most heavily fortified areas imaginable, and now that they had smashed through the quasi-fortified Texas Cap complex, as the 112 paramilitary forces of the Texas Rangers, as well as also the DPS, or Department of Public Safety forces of the Texas troopers guarding this compound, were annihilated or taken POW, as many opted to surrender due to being unable to fight a force of this magnitude, this well-armed and well-trained and well-battle experienced, as they had superior weaponry as well as also loitering munitions in the form of their Lancet 3s equipped with their fragmentation warheads to do both minimal damage to the edifice of the building, but also to eliminate large groupings of infantry-type forces, which these paramilitary elements effectively were, as they had trucked in sandbags to create light machine gun nests as they were issued M249 squad automatic weapons, and as a result, these loitering munitions with a single strike could annihilate an entire squad or more of these forces, as well as also the Texas Ranger snipers on the roof, which were blasted into mangled pieces of bloody human flesh by the fragmentation warheads. As minimal damage had been done to the building itself, the forces that breached of the Russian combat engineers had again, outstanding intelligence as it pertained to the exact rooms and chambers wherein would be found the high-value individuals, who were all captured alive without any issues, and as disjointed American counterattacks were launched by large groupings of armed reactionary civilians finding their way into the north of the downtown of Austin, the Russian artillery forces had fired heavy barrages which were ISR directed, as the AI that monitored the surveillance grid of drones would put together the strike packages for both Russian artillery forces and, of course, definitely the Chinese People's Armed Police artillery forces as well, as the fire direction centers of these forces would receive the pre-created strike packages, which would be passed down to the gun lines, and then the fire missions would ensue. This would enable the artillery forces to fire exceedingly rapidly and remain extremely flexible in their response to supporting their forces in the field if they were ever threatened, as the entire BM-21 Grad rocket battalion of the 207th Motor Rifle Division had concentrated enormous firepower, as every platform within each and every firing battery comprising the battalion had fired on a 1 mile east-west by 1 kilometer north-south area, completely blanketing the area north of the Cap with immense showers of 122 millimeter rocket fires, which annihilated a cluster of nearly 500 armed reactionary civilians who had to bunch up together due to the inability to communicate, as they had to try to organize and coordinate themselves, which is nearly impossible in the environment, with the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes removing all American comms and ISR, minus redundant comms, which were jammed by Russian and Chinese electronic warfare assets, including those of the PLA 68th Group Army to the north, as well as also those of the 2nd Combined Arms Army of Russia in the south and San Antonio, blanketing the Austin area, as well as also even Chinese aircraft, as their heavy strategic bombers, their H-6K squadron that leveled Fort Hood, along with the enormous artillery fires on it from the Chinese 300 millimeter rockets and other artillery systems, had effectively used their KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods to isolate the origins of American radio signals and jam them accordingly with electromagnetic jamming. As the Russians and Chinese had these capabilities, the American redundant communications were completely removed, making it impossible for them to be effective in their coordination and organization. Hence, as would happen exactly in such a situation. Groupings of armed civilians would try to bunch up together and try to communicate in person, or also use messengers, which was a very dangerous job, and would often be annihilated in large groups as a result. And many thousands of non-combatants would also lose their lives due to the areas being outright wiped out by the artillery forces, as they would fire upon the American forces anywhere found and anywhere threatening their field maneuver elements, such as these combat engineers or the Russian mechanized infantry forces or their armored forces, as well as their tanks would be operating now in the south of Austin as one of the two armored battalions with its 4 tank companies, its anti-tank company with their very advanced BMPT Terminator vehicles, and their 2 armored infantry companies, which were effectively just mechanized infantry companies within an armored battalion, would be moving in with 2 full mechanized infantry battalions into the south of Austin to clear it of all armed reactionary civilian elements, as this armored battalion and these 2 mechanized infantry battalions, who had already cleared the flanks in the southwest of the city, were now moving against the armed reactionary civilians in South Austin, as this mechanized infantry battalion would surround and destroy this grouping, while the other 2 battalions, one armored and the other mechanized infantry, would move into the area in the south of Austin across the Colorado River and annihilate these pockets of armed reactionary civilians, while the Russian combat engineers had captured and consolidated their position at the CAP compound, as the 6 total combat companies of combat engineers from the battalion, having had laid their PMP pontoon bridge, leaving behind their headquarters and support company and one of their 7 combat companies to guard the bridge, as this mechanized infantry battalion, having early on cleared the flanks, had moved in behind them and crossed the bridge and was now occupying North Austin, while the combat engineers moved gradually through, clearing armed reactionary civilian elements until capturing the CAP complex, which was a major political objective of this campaign. And now they held their positions in the battered areas of North Austin, which had been heavily shelled and rocketed by this point, as the People's Armed Police on the other side of I-35 had cleared all resistance along the highway and were likewise positioned in North Austin, literally adjacent to the Russian combat engineer forces, who now held firmly their positions in the CAP complex and along I-35, as the first 2 combat engineer companies of the 6 to move in had broken up into where one company secured the highway while the other took and secured the CAP building, and now the other 4 companies moved in to boost their numbers in this area, making them exceedingly formidable and powerful, as the artillery had annihilated the entire section of the city surrounding the CAP complex. The armed reactionary civilian elements, having had been targeted by precision strikes put together by the ISR and AI system, monitoring the battlefield in real time and crunching various domains of data, had also created these strike packages for the artillery, as well as guiding the AI guidance system on the AI target-seeking mode of the loitering munitions. And even the Chinese Wingloom 2 combat drone patrolled the I-35 segment, looking for armed reactionary civilian elements on the highway or near it to destroy, which they had done exceedingly well. As these forces held their positions in the north of the downtown area, as the artillery stood by ready for more fire missions, the Chinese People's Armed Police Forces had moved through the suburbs and the city proper, clearing the flanks of the armed reactionary civilian forces, as they had enormous loitering munition support from their CH-901As and even their dedicated combat drones in the form of their Wingloom 2s, which also provided overwatch to the ground forces supporting them in all of their operations, as these vehicles had heavy firepower from their APC WZ-551 versions with their turret-based W-85 heavy machine guns, 12.7mm, to their upgunned IFV versions with the very powerful 30mm autocannon and 7.62 by 54mm coax machine gun. As these paramilitary MRAPs, which were passed down through certain programs to the paramilitary alphabet forces and local paramilitary forces from the state and local levels, had received older armored vehicles like this armor personnel carrier, this M113, as well as these two Max Pro MRAPs, which were sitting here burning after they had been annihilated by autocannon fire, shredding right through them with AP armor-piercing ammunition, or APHE ammunition, especially, as it was highly destructive, tore right through these vehicles, and even the dismounts with their weapons, such as this dismounted squad with its riflemen watching different sectors of, including these two with bayonets to check the KIAs to make sure no one was faking their death, as well as their flamethrower operator with his Type 74 opting to leave his rifle in the vehicle and switch it out for the flamethrower, and their light machine gunner with the QBJ-201 with his extremely high rate of fire, and the other riflemen, some of which even had 35mm grenade tubes beneath their QBZ-95 rifles. As this man was trying to surrender and threw his weapon to the side, the light machine gunner and riflemen simply lit him up, hit him in the head and the chest as he put his hands up to surrender. With this machine gunner in the turret firing at this destroyed vehicle, and the autocannon being fired at a target that was off of this illustration or animation, if you will. And, of course, the CH-901 loitering over the area looking for a target on AI target-seeking mode, with the combat drone firing two very powerful CM502KG dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missiles as they could penetrate battleship armor at this house to destroy it, as the quadcopter asset had mapped out the entire area in real time ahead of this platoon and had the exact positionings of all friendly and enemy forces everywhere they were found, including enemies that had run into this house. As Chinese artillery from their 130mm howitzers were hitting this hillside and hitting armed reactionary civilians on this hill across from this street, and abandoned cars were a common sight by this point, Wingloom 2s were firing missiles at targets such as this destroyed shopping center, as armed resistance had been spotted near it, and they were firing a missile at it, as this house was also to be destroyed. As in this suburban area, in this empty lot, many armed reactionary civilian elements had gathered together trying to communicate and coordinate their actions, including even with paramilitary forces moving in with their heavier vehicles, all of which being destroyed by the highly mobile and destructive elite infantry-type forces of the People's Armed Police, as their platoon moved in and annihilated the armored vehicles with ease, including also dismounts with their rocket-propelled grenades, their Chinese Type 69s with anti-armor and anti-personnel rounds available, as well as their anti-tank man-portable systems of their HJ-08 missiles, as well as also their flamethrower operator and also light machine gunner and all their riflemen, as they had heavy machine gun support from their mobile machine gun nests effectively in the form of their APCs, as well as their very powerful IFVs. These forces, with their combat drone support and loitering munition support, were an unbeatable force, as they also had ISR dominance, which guided everything from the AI target-seeking mode to the combat drones to the forces on the ground and their movements and coordination with everything else. As the fragmentation warhead-equipped loitering munitions struck these forces and threw the mangled, bloodied bodies in all directions, and twisted metal, which used to be vehicles, were all shredded up from the fragmentation warheads. The People's Armed Police forces were a highly effective fighting force as they moved through the area, such as in this wedge formation, as they had other squads in the other vehicles they could dismount, including their fifth vehicle just off of this illustration or animation, as sights like this were common, including the artillery crashing in the near distance, as enemy targets had been spotted and were being annihilated bit by bit, as the People's Armed Police fought fanatically, as they were the Praetorian Guard, Waffen-SS-like element of the CCP regime of China, and sometimes they even fought more fanatically than even their PLA counterparts, although the PLA was equally extremely tough. But the People's Armed Police had a certain gusto about them, as they were gung-ho and raced into danger, as they were fanatical and would crush all opposition with the utmost brutality, leading to them committing heinous atrocities and high body counts of many victims, including turning them into road signs, such as this sign that says "this way" in Mandarin. as well as other atrocities that they would commit with glee, as they burnt the nation down and slaughtered its people. The People's Armed Police were also equipped to take on enemy military units, and they equally did this with great gusto, as they were heavily supported by loitering munitions, their ISR constellation of drones, and would move through the downtown area, annihilating all opposition as they moved tactically, covering all directions of fire. And they would try to take the downtown as much intact as was physically, humanly possible. Although it wouldn't always be possible, their forces would go in and clear buildings like clockwork of enemy forces who would try to resist them, as even out on the streets, their vehicles would move up along with the troops in their tactical fighting formations and would annihilate all in their wake, as the armed reactionary civilians that opposed them lacked effective communications, they lacked ISR, they lacked actionable intel, while for the People's Armed Police, they had total AI and IT dominance, they had total firepower dominance, and they had tactical superiority on their side as well. And their constellation of ISR networks integrated with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, including even artillery support when needed, and even air power, if absolutely required, made these Russian and Chinese forces an exceptionally powerful fighting force on the Austin battlefield, as they had total superiority in everything, as the forces of both the People's Armed Police and the Russian Army were highly combat experienced, as the People's Armed Police had over the years crushed many uprisings, as there had been forces that tried to bring in weapons and bad actors into Xinjiang, but were brutally crushed by the fanatical CCP regime paramilitary forces of the People's Armed Police. And this earned them extensive combat experience that they now brought to America, as these were a highly mobile elite strike force as it pertained to the PAP, and the Russian army forces were a heavy fighting force as well in this area. Both working together conducted expert combat operations as they took the field of battle in each and every instance of combat. And now, going to the map, the downtown area was a major objective of the coalition, as was total complete control of the entire node of Austin along I-35, as the external invasion components, according to fourth generation warfare doctrines, needed a clear invasion route all the way inland to their final destination. And Austin was a key node along this route, so the Trojan shock armies of both the Russians and of the Chinese had to avidly take control of this area, and they would absolutely do so, as their forces were on the march everywhere, and they would take their red zone, and they would do it with a high degree of precision, as they would clear buildings and they would move down the street and eliminate all enemy forces found, especially those in the open, which would fall prey to loitering munitions, as well as Chinese combat drones, even Russian loitering munitions as well. Although in the downtown area, the use of artillery, at least in the area to the south of the Cap complex, would be highly off limits, and the Chinese would request that the Russians use absolutely little to no artillery in this area, except to the south of the Colorado River, which was not seen as important as what was the red zone just to the north of the river, which would connect to the Cap complex, although the area around the Cap had been heavily shelled and rocketed. The free labor force, which was the civilian population, would be conscripted and forced to live in the Laogai that would be constructed by the 250th Construction Battalion, moving in to create not just a FOB where they currently were on the Austin Municipal, but the mega FOB and Laogai complex in the captured Austin Bergstrom International Airport, which would be the next major objective after the downtown had been captured for the Red Zone, as the Chinese construction forces would build forward operating bases, and even the Russian combat engineers would assist in this effort, as they would put up HESCO-like walls, guard towers, concrete T-walls, as well as tents and modular portable buildings, which could be constructed into larger buildings with different pieces trucked in from Mexico. They would also expand runways for cargo aircraft to bring in troops and more supplies and conduct troop rotations, as the Chinese construction forces were already at work early on in the fighting, transforming the Austin Municipal into a satellite FOB of what would become the mega FOB just to the immediate east of the Red Zone, which would be connected to the future colonial governor's residence after repairs would be done on the facade, including all the windows and some of the damaged walls, which was very minimal but had been effectively done during the capture of the building, as some heavy firepower had been levied upon it, although very little, as attempts were made painstakingly to preserve the building as much as was humanly possible with the assets available. And as the Russian forces moved in and cleared the building and took the high-value individuals captive, they had achieved, again, a major objective of the entire operation. And now the People's Armed Police moving in to capture downtown, and the Russian Armored Battalion and 2 mechanized infantry battalions moving in to clear the south of the city before moving on to eliminate the last American military forces of the 1st of the 355th, who were already receiving occasional sporadic shelling from Chinese ISR-guided artillery strikes by the AI data processing system, or Russian howitzer-based artillery strikes, although again, for now it was very limited, as painstaking efforts were taken not to damage the future megafob as much as possible, as the buildings needed to remain intact, as did the runways. And now, if we go to the map of downtown, this covers a 2-mile east to west by 1 mile north-south area. The Cap complex, in its shelled out, annihilated area of northern downtown, was a mile to the north of this area. This was the Route 1 tollway. This is I-35, the most important roadway in the entire campaign. And of course, this was a portion of the tollway of the 138 highway, or the 183 highway rather. As Russian artillery opens up this map, hitting Zilker Park and other areas to the south of the river, these forces in this area are outright annihilated by the artillery strikes as they cross this bridge. A Russian artillery shell had hit this bridge, although it was just a street bridge, so ultimately there was no big deal made of it, but they were told to limit their artillery strikes because they needed I-35 and its 2 access road bridges to be fully intact. So the artillery was kept in the Zilker Park area, and only 2 strikes across the river in the actual downtown portion, which would destroy this technical, although the dismounts would actually get away and briefly pause in this area as their truck would be annihilated. And loitering munitions like Lancet 3s and CH-901As would be roving the area looking for targets, including CH-901As hitting those on the roof of this hotel and on the roof of this parking garage in this area, as well as also loitering munition strikes hitting this civilian vehicle, as well as also this truck right here, and more, as the dedicated Wing-Lung 2 combat drone in this area and another in this area would swing on and fire to this area behind all of these buildings, these hotels and businesses, and destroy this grouping of armed reactionary civilians and their trucks that moved in for attempted safety. Loitering munition strikes from Lancet 3s would annihilate all of these vehicles and personnel on the roof, including a CH-901A strike here, as these vehicles, these Russian vehicles from their MTLBs with their heavy machine guns and their BMP-3 were firing into this building because they had taken sporadic fire from inside, but the return fire meted out was massive, and they shredded up the Americans that were using this building as cover to fire at them from, as some of their squads had been dismounted into this rubble pile area, and one in a rolling shield double column formation behind this APC. This platoon would guard the bridge here while they had briefly taken fire from the roof. The loitering munitions had solved that problem, while there was another platoon here and off the map watching this area. These armed civilians would be cut down by the vehicle fire coming from this platoon over here, but the rest would flee into this building and briefly stop there and then move into the parking area beyond and run north, as these two technicals would also race north, but they would be racing into the arms of Russian forces that were north of this area, again in control of the cap complex, wherein they had consolidated their control with the other 4 of the 6 combat companies of their battalion, as they left one combat company and their headquarters and support company to guard their pontoon bridge, as the mechanized infantry that cleared the flanks moved in behind them into North Austin, while they moved and cleared the flanks and took the cap complex and held the north of downtown, which was horribly rocket and shell battered, as the rocket and shell strikes in the area were massive, as they had annihilated a massive group of armed civilians with the shelling and rocketing, again, as mentioned in the previous installation. As they held this area and the Chinese moved in from this area, they were in the process, in effect, of clearing South Austin and downtown in order to go for their final objective, which was the international airport, the Austin-Bergstrom Airport. As Russian tanks of their tank companies, as 2 tank companies would be operating in this area in particular, as well as armored infantry troops, which were effectively the mechanized infantry forces in an armored battalion, were clearing the buildings in this area, as there were 3 squads going into this building, and this squad went outside as per SOP, and 1 squad came out on the roof here, as these 3 squads would move into this, clear this building and these buildings on the side, while the vehicles, the tanks, were outside. These forces held their position and earlier were firing into the building with the vehicles, and the artillery had annihilated these forces, and loitering munition strikes from Lancet 3s and CH-901As got these personnel on the roof. These paramilitary vehicles, these MRAPs, were hit by loitering munitions and destroyed, as these had HE warheads. There was a combination of Russian Lancet 3s with fragmentation and HE warheads, and the HEs were enough to destroy the MRAPs by crashing down upon their roof and annihilating these vehicles. And the Chinese, all of their loitering munitions were strictly equipped with the fragmentation warheads. Not only because they wanted to preserve the building, but because these would annihilate massive groupings of infantry-type forces and their light vehicles, as their IFVs with their very powerful 30mm autocannons and their APCs with their also powerful anti-materiel heavy machine guns, their W85 12.7mm, were laying down enormous fire into this area. As this entire combat company moved into the area, leaving their headquarters and command elements behind, this company moved through this area as their squads bounded and attacked these American armed reactionary civilians, which is why this arrow is encapsulated in red, as they used their flamethrower to completely annihilate them in combination with small arms fire as they came around the corner, this squad right here, while this squad went into this building and then came out and was in a wedge formation to be able to offer fire support into each building, as this squad went to clear this building and then would move and clear this one, as this squad, after annihilating these armed reactionary civilians and then receiving help from them, as they would have interlocking fields of fire, they then cleared this building with this squad moving through the alley as per SOP, as these squads moved through here. As all of this activity was happening, different activity throughout this entire area, this was a large area with a lot going on, these vehicles moved up as this platoon was fully dismounted. This squad, this squad, this squad, this squad, and this squad were part of this platoon right here. While these platoons had not dismounted their squads, but this platoon would dismount one to clear this building and then this building while the vehicles moved up as per SOP. And the entire time the vehicles are laying down heavy fire down the street. This is the civilian light rail system, and this is the train station as the rails go into it. As some of the light rail was above ground and some was not, the train station right here was hit on the roof by a Lancet 3, hitting these Americans on the roof while this vehicle moved up and out into the street. They were fired at by Chinese heavy weapons aboard their IFV, leading the platoon. As they shredded up, including these dismounts that got out of the truck before artillery came in and annihilated it, they got to this area and were intercepted by Chinese fire. As these forces again at the opening had crossed and were hit by artillery and annihilated, this vehicle moving into this area here would be hit by a Russian loitering munition, as would these vehicles moving into this area here. As the Russian Lancet 3s were all throughout the area, as were the Chinese CH-901As that annihilated these personnel on the roof, and as these trucks all converged and moved into this area, these armed reactionary civilian technicals, they were cut down by the rear vehicle's heavy machine gunner using his W-85 to shred these trucks into pieces, whole riddled pieces, as they cut down all of these trucks and basically made them hole-ridden, twisted metal from the heavy machine gun fire on the last vehicle, as they had staggered weapons covering all their fields of fire 180 degrees each direction. This way, this way, this way, and the back. And this guy in the back on the turret shredded these vehicles up, racing down the street here. As also, these forces went through and cleared these buildings, and this squad cleared these buildings. At the opening, there were exchanges of fire between these armed reactionary civilians and these two groupings along this side of the street, and they were firing at these Chinese vehicles, as indicated by the green, seeing they were taking fire, but the small arms fire could do nothing to the vehicles, and the vehicles laid down enormous volumes of 30mm autocannon fire and coax machine gun fire from the 7.62 by 54mm machine gun. This combat drone fired CM502KGs. Two hit these three trucks in the back and blasted them into pieces, while these others were intercepted by Chinese CH-901As and destroyed on I-35. The other two CM502KGs went and hit this group and this group, as this group also came around and was intercepted by ground-based fires at the same time. As these two dismounted squads from this platoon, as they all fanned their squads out and moved through the area, as this was a full combat company with its headquarters elements right here and a bit off map, with this company's headquarters platoon off map as well. These PAP troops would have some WIAs as they faced off against these groupings of civilians under the highway and beyond, and as fire was exchanged, interlocking fields of fire and vehicle-based fire, they annihilated these armed reactionary civilians before the vehicles moved up. And although they had some WIAs, the combat medics came and picked them up and took them back to the casualty collection point, which was effectively the positioning of the headquarters platoon itself, as the ambulance, which was a truck, a Shangji ambulance truck for the platoon, the headquarters platoon, moved in and picked these forces up. The rest of the squad continued to move on and engage armed reactionary civilians throughout the area, including those hit by the missile strikes, as the movement here was rapid and coinciding with the ground-based fire with these missile strikes into the area, including fire coming here. Interlocking tactical fields of fire all throughout this map, multiple examples of it. As the L vector of fire, as all these staggered weapons on this company moving into this area would fire into these forces, and although they would take some fire, the heavy machine gun and 30mm autocannon fire and 7.62 coax fire simply shredded these forces up in this vehicle. These loitering munitions annihilated all these armed reactionary civilian vehicles moving on the southbound lane. These CH-901As came in and annihilated all of them. As these forces tried to move up the street, they were intercepted by a loitering munition and heavy fire coming from up the street, as the firepower from this column of vehicles, led by the very powerful IFV, shredded up all the armed reactionary civilian elements, as they tried to move up the street. The personnel and the vehicles were simply annihilated, also in this direction as well. As the PAP, another platoon moving in this direction, deployed all of its squads, 3 into this building, as well as also this squad moving through the alley to clear this building. These forces would eventually go back down into the building, and there would be a massive fight inside the convention center between this squad and these forces on the roof that went back into the building, as some would already be KIA'd. As this People's Armed Police double column formation went in to clear this building, another squad was on the roof providing tactical overwatch to their forces crossing. As this double column rolling shield moved up, they deployed from behind their vehicle into this building. They actually cleared the building, came up from the roof access behind these armed reactionary civilians, and cut them down before then reorienting their position this way. And they fired on these forces, causing them to go in when this squad at the same time was going to clear the convention center. And before they did so, they annihilated this truck in the alley, and this truck as well. As these forces on the roof were being engaged by a squad here and a squad here on the roof access, firing back and forth with each other, and the squad in the alley even firing up at them. The vehicles then moved here but had overwatch from the deployed forces on the roof. Tactical overwatch of the forces on the ground, of their vehicles, to protect them from any attempt to throw Molotovs if they possessed any, but they did not. And as these forces moved through the area, effectively this whole area was blocked off by People's Armed Police platoons of 2 different companies, as this was a combat company, this was a combat company, and this was a combat company. 3 out of 7 combat companies were operating in this area of downtown. As the Russian armored forces and armored infantry moved and cleared all these forces out of these buildings, as the Russian armored infantry forces were very tough, and as they went in to clear these buildings, they engaged all of the armed civilians in these buildings. The Russians would suffer several KIAs and some WIAs amongst their armored infantry forces, but for the most part, they provided tactical overwatch on the roof, fired at these forces, and cut them down, allowing for this squad to go to this area right here. And as they fired down into these forces, they ran out and were cut down by the heavy machine gun turret gunners and coax weapons on the main battle tanks as they tried to flee from this parking area on the city block. As the tanks moved up, they fired directly into this rubbled building, this pancaked building. They fired frag T shells and annihilated these personnel, as well as heavy machine gun fire as they moved up and stopped temporarily this company right here. Before then, moving again around this area before stopping, cordoning off this area with the armored infantry moving through. As these forces ran out, they were again cut down by the tank-based firepower from heavy machine guns and coax machine guns as these tanks continued to move and fired while on the move, effectively an armored drive-by of sorts. As now these forces were running out, they too were cut down by the tanks, although they opened fire on these tanks, including these forces, before they got a shell vectored into their position. They were all cut down by the tank-based fires, and as these armored infantry forces moved in and cleared these areas, these 3 squads moved in, they would leave 2 squads here, and then 2 squads would move and take position on this city block, as their tanks would continue on, as I-35 was the prime objective, and 2 Russian Su-34s carrying enormous payloads had flown over this area and dropped their GLONASS guided or satellite guided munitions for extra precision, dropping their KAB 500S munitions, which were over 1,000 pounds each, and annihilated all these technicals and personnel taking cover on this side of the river across the street, as the PAP also fired over here, but the airdrop munitions simply wiped all these forces out. And as the tanks continued on from this one tank company, as again, this was only part of the armored battalion. There was also the whole mechanized infantry battalion and the rest of the armored battalion, as they had 2 additional tank companies, another armored infantry company, their anti-tank company, and their headquarters and support company. But this was only 2 tank companies and 1 armored infantry company in the area, as they had their different platoons deployed, including right here, clearing these buildings, ending up with 2 squads holding position right here on the other side of the Route 1 tollway. This vehicle on the tollway was destroyed by a Lancet 3 loitering munition, as this combat drone destroyed all these forces by coming down and vectoring missiles in at the right angle, while loitering munitions handled these enemies on the roof. As the Combat was highly precise in this area, with loitering munitions and ground-based fires coordinated together through the real-time battlefield AI data processing network. Even the Russian artillery was exceedingly precise and was very carefully used to destroy these forces, and these forces had fled, some even swimming across the river while others taking the bridge, and were intercepted by one of these People's Armed Police squads as one got on the roof to provide overwatch to their forces and fire down at the remnants of these enemies here, while the other squad moved through after the building was cleared into this area and intercepted those coming across with their flamethrower operator with his Type 74 flamethrower, charring these human beings into burnt, crispy pieces of flesh and bone, while the small arms fire directed from the squad was fired as well. Even the vehicles moved in and partook, with heavy machine gun fire L-vectored through this alleyway at these forces trying to come across. Tactical vectoring of fire. This was the city hall, which this squad would move in, clear, and get onto the roof of. And as these forces were moving into the area, the ground-based fires from these vehicles was simply too much to bear. And all of these vehicles coming around the corner and that were sitting here, including this local SWAT paramilitary vehicle trying to guard the city hall, was simply annihilated by the 30mm autocannon fire and also 12.7mm fire from follow-up vehicles firing into any of these surviving forces, as the vector, angle, and traverse of weapons was all guided by the AI system. The fire was precise. Precision was everything. And the fire vectored down from the tops of buildings, and as this building was fought over inside by this squad, they eventually prevailed over these Americans that survived and went down into the building, while these others were KIA'd from the fire coming from the roof of this building. As the fire coming from this building had annihilated these personnel, this squad deployed in and again came on the roof, annihilated these civilians from the back, and then took their position. The squad was clearing this building. These vehicles had been destroyed by the squad here, as they had their rocket-propelled grenades, they had their HJO-8 anti-tank missiles as an option, also flamethrower operators, and small arms, which were enough to shred up these vehicles. As their vehicles moved into position and basically cordoned off and blocked this entire area, with this platoon moving forward to take the city hall and vector fire at these forces. Fire vector down like an X vector of fire into this area, including fire being vectored into this area. Again, the turret-based machine gunners would aim slightly down, angle, and traverse of weapons for safety, and would shred up all these forces. If any had even survived, all of the missile and loitering munition strikes, as well as all the firepower coming from the vehicles. As again, these vehicles had all been shredded up by the rear vehicle here, firing at them as they came under this Route 1 tollway, with loitering munitions also hitting targets in the area as well. Lancet 3 hit enemy personnel on the roof of this building, and as these personnel were annihilated by the vehicle-based fires, and then this squad on the roof watching this area, the vehicles that deployed into this area had annihilated, intercepting all of these fleeing forces moving through this area as the vehicles annihilated them, along with the troops moving into the area, firing out of buildings as well, and moving through the alleyway as per SOP, while this squad cleared this building, and this squad here, upon finishing this building, had moved into this area after they intercepted, along with the fire coming from the vehicles, these forces trying to go this way. And then as these forces were hit by missiles and ground-based fire, they were simply annihilated. That was the total tactical superiority of the People's Armed Police in this combat situation, as they had other dismounted squads of other platoons moving through this area here to take up the rear security and ensure that there were no arising threats behind the advance of their main forces operating in this sector. They held these areas, including on top of the parking garage, and these squads would remain on the rooftops of these buildings. After this squad had some WIAs, they continued into this area along with this squad, as this squad, and these three squads that cleared these buildings were part of this platoon, while again, this vehicle platoon dismounted one of their 5 squads to clear these buildings. This platoon dismounted none, but held this position as the vehicles moved up while their forces cleared the area. They had total fire dominance from different sides, as this entire combat company element could fire under the highway in this direction. This platoon moving into the area could fire in this direction, with forces on the roof to monitor all these different areas of the city. They had total fire dominance over this entire portion of the city after they had captured it, thoroughly liquidated all the threats in the area. The armed reactionary civilians had no means of communication, no means to effectively organize. They only had small arms and very few Molotovs, which they never really even got to deploy because the coordination and communication dominance, ISR dominance of the People's Armed Police all working together as a team with all the heavy firepower they possessed, simply wiped out their opposition. Along with loitering munitions and combat drone support, they had everything they needed in this area to dominate all of the threats, and the Russians held their sector and captured and cleared the south of Austin. As this tank company would remain in the area and simply move around this direction, this tank company would continue on to I-35 and ensure that they had fields of fire beyond, as they would clear the area of armed reactionary civilians to ensure that the operation to capture the red zone had been thoroughly completed and done with precision. As this was a very surgical operation, it must be understood. All of these actions were highly surgical, from the forces taking positions on roofs to overwatch their troops on the ground and vehicles on the ground to protect them from Molotov attacks, mutual support between infantry and vehicles, as well as also the heavy vehicle-based firepower, which acted as a mobile fire support platform for their troops, annihilating enemy forces on the ground and vehicles with their heavy machine guns and their IFV-based 30mm autocannon fire, which was simply massively destructive. And as these highly mobile strike forces of the People's Armed Police rapidly seized control of this entire portion of the city, the American forces were simply annihilated by the vehicle-based fires coming from these People's Armed Police forces, as well as their combat drones, loitering munitions for their CH-901As, as well as also Russian Lancet 3s operating in the area as well that hit targets, CH-901A strikes. All of these forces that were hit by artillery in the Zilker Park area, as well as even a bit beyond, were outright annihilated and chased into other areas where People's Armed Police annihilated them. Heavy munitions were dropped on other forces. The tank-based firepower from the 125mm main tank guns were massive. Everything from frag T shells to HE ammunition to heat ammunition and other types of ammunition. If they had to destroy very powerful vehicles like other tanks, they had ATGMs as well as very potent tungsten sabot ammunition they could utilize as well. And of course, they had their air power, again, their Su-34s, which each one could carry 26,000 pounds of ordnance, dropping them on enemy targets. As the Russian forces and the Chinese People's Armed Police simply dominated in this battle and had surgically captured downtown with minimal losses as they watched all their fields of fire, the tactical superiority plus the combat drone support and loitering munition support ensured that the People's Armed Police crushed the American armed reactionary civilians and some of the paramilitary forces that were operating in the area as well. As they captured the city hall, they also annihilated all resistance in the downtown, as they tactically had operated with a high degree of efficiency with all of their supporting elements, including, if needed, their artillery, but they would not end up using their artillery, and they told the Russians to limit their use of artillery as the downtown was to be captured as much intact as was humanly possible, and the Russians obliged